Hello and welcome back. I'm Sarah Mueller, a reporter with Forbes, and today I am joined by Dr. Kelly Winfrey with Iowa State University. Dr. Kelly Winfrey, I can't even imagine what type of week we're having. It's been insane, right? I mean, I need to know your initial reactions to Kamala Harris entering the race with her partner Biden dropping out. It's kind of a switch up we didn't really see coming.
It was certainly a surprise given the number of times that President Biden said he wasn't dropping out. To see that come across my social media and text messaging kind of all at once on Sunday afternoon. So I think it was a surprise to a lot of people, but at the same time, we'd been talking about what ifs for a little while, especially since his lackluster debate performance. So I think a lot of us had thought this is a possibility, but probably not going to happen. So it was a surprise, but not a total surprise.
Yeah, and before you and I got on our call, we were talking about how there's this kind of, we love talking about potential opportunities or changes in the race, but for it to actually happen, especially this late in the race, we are only a couple weeks away from the DNC. So, I mean, I want to know kind of your first reaction to what this means for the Trump campaign, especially given the recent assassination attempt.
Well, I think that's a great question. And I believe former President Trump had made a statement in the past day or so that they've had to totally change everything up because they have a new opponent. And that's exactly correct, right? They've been campaigning against Joe Biden, very much focusing on his age and competency. And that was really one of their stronger arguments. And now that's gone. So it's really going to force them to very quickly come up with a new strategy to try to best Kamala Harris, especially now that Donald Trump is the oldest ever presidential candidate. So it really turned the tables, and I think will cause a lot of upheaval in his campaign. But I'll say they should have at least had a backup plan, right? Given Biden's age, given that debate performance, there should have been, as a campaign team, a what if, so that they had some strategy ready to go. We'll see what that ends up looking like, though.
Do you have any guesses what you think they're going to try and target her on?
You know, I mean, I fully expect to see lots of sexism and racism, to be honest. From what I study and what we saw with Harris as the VP nominee in 2020, there was rampant sexism and racism. I mean, straight up kind of vulgar commentary on Twitter. I expect there'll be some of that in the social media realm. We've already heard JD Vance say that she was a childless cat lady who was miserable. So, I expect fully that sort of thing also just from President Trump. That's his style, is to kind of name call and go after things like that. But I think probably you will hear some discussion of certain issues like immigration. In particular, Harris kind of headed that up when she first became vice president. And also still trying to attack on some of the same issues since she's been part of the current administration. Some of the same attacks that are issue-based that they were planning to use toward Biden should also be at least somewhat useful against Harris.
Yeah, we are only a few weeks away from that DNC where she's going to need all those delegates she can get. Now, what's going to be kind of that fight for the delegates look like? I mean, we kind of have had a couple of potential candidates say, you know what, no, I'm not going to run against, Harris. This is her race. But could anybody come up from the back end and say, yeah, I'm going to run against her?
I think we'll have to wait and see what the DNC decides to do with the process. So their plan had been to do a roll call vote on or before August 7th to formally nominate or vote for Biden as the nominee. That was kind of an arbitrary deadline that the party had set for themselves, given how late the convention is and some kind of questions about state laws and being on ballot. So really, someone could put their name out there, but most of the folks that I would say would be good contenders have thrown their support behind Harris very quickly. We've seen a very quick kind of coalescing around Harris, and we have Pete Buttigieg, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, all these folks who have been mentioned as possible candidates have said they fully support Harris. So I think the party and party leadership, and that includes our Democratic governors across the country, have very quickly backed Harris to show that the party is united on that front, which is really important given this late in the race. We don't want to have, from a Democratic perspective, we don't want to have a bunch of people fighting against each other and allow the opponent to just sit back and watch it happen. They need to be ready to campaign against Trump. So I think the party's done a good job with that. The other thing I'd mention is that we already have a lot of state parties, including Iowa, who have pledged their delegates to Harris. So a lot of this work is kind of being done already. The other kind of piece of this is I hear some folks say, well, can she get on the ballot at this point? And what's going to happen? Is it fair? Is it breaking some sort of laws? And it's important to remember that conventions are party events, right? All of the primaries, the nomination process is all done by the party. That is not a government thing. So no one's breaking any laws by deciding the candidate. Joe Biden wasn't going to be the official nominee until that convention was over. So we still have a few weeks before that happens anyway, and that's plenty of time. That's after the convention is when the parties submit the name of their presidential candidates to the states to put on the ballot. So there's not as much concern about that as I think initially people were maybe worrying or some are hoping for, depending on what side of the aisle.
You threw out a name that I think is really important to watch, which is Pete Buttigieg. There's so much talk about VP candidates for the VP. And I think you and I live in Iowa. We saw Pete Buttigieg, people caucus for him and whatnot. And it was kind of strange how he was polling pretty far ahead. And then I remember being in the newsroom when it happened that we were going to have this big convention downtown Des Moines where a bunch of candidates could talk. And he was supposed to speak. And just before the convention, he dropped out. He announced he dropped out. And it was kind of wild because he was already polling far ahead. So we kind of all assumed that had to do with maybe campaign funds, wasn't making enough money to make it to the other states. So from that experience, I think we've watched there is interest in Pete Buttigieg in an official office of some capacity. Now, he has not necessarily been elected. He is in Department of Transportation right now, and that was selected by Biden. But what are his chances? Who are you looking at VP candidates here? Because there's kind of a roster of people.
Yeah, Pete Buttigieg is on a lot of people's tongue for that possible nomination as vice president. Buttigieg is a great speaker. He is very relatable. He's younger. He and his partner are great on social media, great on media. I think that Buttigieg could be a really good pick for really engaging people and getting energy up, especially younger voters. The downside, like you said, is that he hasn't held a national, federal level elected position. He was known as Mayor Pete when he was running for the vice presidency. So there's limited experience in that sense, though he has had to deal with a lot of things as Secretary of Transportation, airline outages, train derailments, all sort of stuff that he's had to handle and has I would say, handled pretty well. Also coming from Indiana, he's coming from that kind of Rust Belt area and maybe could appeal to some of those voters in key states. I would say, though, in modern elections, we haven't really selected vice presidential nominees based on where they're from or winning a state because kind of we've just got a handful of swing states at this point. However, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is pretty popular in Pennsylvania. Obviously, if you remember back to 2020, Pennsylvania was one of those states that we were waiting to hear a final decision on. So if someone like him could bring a state like Pennsylvania firmly into the Democratic column, that would be a huge win. Mark Kelly in Arizona is another one I've heard people mention. I question whether or not we want to, whether the Democrats would want to put him out of the Senate. That's a very contested Senate seat. So I don't know how great of a pick he would be, but I know they're vetting him. I think they just released a shortlist earlier today of some folks that they had, the Harris campaign had solicited materials from to start the vetting process. And so he was one of those as well. And then we have the Kentucky governor, someone else, though I don't think we're going to turn Kentucky blue. So he's a very he's a younger, very dynamic speaker, but not probably not going to deliver that home state. But maybe could appeal to some white working class voters in the middle of the country.
Let's talk about that appeal, because moderates are the main conversation. Those voters that are not committed to a party, maybe looked at the election before and said, I don't want to see another 2020. I don't like either candidate. Now we've had a whole switch up with Harris coming in. What do you think that's going to do? What does she need to do specifically that maybe Biden wasn't doing for moderate voters?
Well, I think one thing is that she's gotten people excited and interested. I know personally, as a voter and as someone who studies politics, I had kind of, resigned myself to this is going to be a slow train wreck of a campaign, and from both sides. And then overnight or middle of Sunday afternoon, that all changed. And so the amount of energy that this switch up has caused among Democrats, among anyone who's kind of an anti-Trump voter, I think is noteworthy. The big thing for her, I think, in terms of moderate voters, is making sure that she can win the same voters Biden won in 2020. So if there were moderate Republicans who were not happy with Trump, people who don't vote as often, young people, things like that, that maybe voted against Trump and for Biden, getting those folks mobilized are important. I also think Harris has the potential to mobilize women voters in a way that hasn't been done in quite a while. In 2016, Hillary Clinton obviously didn't win. She did foretell some things that might happen, especially around reproductive rights. Now that we are in a post-Dobbs world where we have increased restrictions on reproductive rights in a lot of states, there's an opportunity to really mobilize women voters in particular around issues around rights, especially against someone like Trump, who has a questionable background at best in terms of his treatment of women. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's also a lot of opportunity with young voters that maybe Biden didn't have. Like I said, it seemed like it was going to be kind of just a boring campaign of two old men. And now we've got Harris engaging with Gen Z on social media and really trying to connect. And I think that's another big part that we'll see, is to try to get younger folks to turn out, maybe more like we did in 2008 when Obama was mobilizing some groups that weren't already typical voters.
Now, I've been covering this campaign now for a year and a half ahead of the Iowa caucuses. You and I have been talking for a year and a half about it. And even far back as, when Nikki Haley got into the race, talking about what a woman in this race would look like and how it would change things up. Now, this is a whole different dynamic we weren't expecting. But one thing I hear over and over again when I was on the campaign trail is just a ton of people saying, I just don't want to vote for Trump. I just don't want to vote for Biden, but I still want my party to win. And so now we've talked about a lot of issues, kitchen table issues, economy, obviously immigration. That was something that Kamala was supposed to be in charge of for the Biden administration. So what do you think is now going to be of her track record, things she's done in the past? What do you think is going to be brought up either in her favor or possibly against her?
I think the big things, reproductive rights will be a big issue. LGBTQ rights will be a big issue. And that is a very clear divide. And those are both issues that overwhelmingly the population sides a little more to the left on. Now, that might not be the primary issue they vote on, but that's one area. She was handed an immigration crisis whenever they took office, which was, I'd say, a little unfair to her as a new VP to have to start taking that on, but she did make some progress. She's also been very active with Joe Biden in economic recovery work, leadership in the Senate. Her background as a prosecutor, something that she's talked about when she was running for the nomination in 2019. It's come back into the conversation again. She's a prosecutor versus a felon, that sort of narrative that she's on the right side of the law. And larger questions about the role of government and our democracy will probably be big issues, given where the Supreme Court's decisions have landed in the past few years and things that both parties have said about where they want the country to go. So I think we're going to see kind of some big picture conversations around what do we want government to be doing for people or not doing for people, and what is that role, and what is that role for different types of people.
We could potentially see a Trump-Harris debate, which would be drastically different, I believe, than what we saw just a couple weeks ago. But what do you think, voters will maybe be looking at that debate? What do you think will be maybe brought up? I think one of the things that I heard most from people discussing after the last debate was that none of the moderators' questions were properly answered. Do you think that it'll be more traditional debate than what we've seen the last couple of times?
I think Harris will give you a more traditional debate than what we've seen. And I think she'll do a fantastic job. If you think back to her vice presidential debate against Mike Pence, and some of the debates that she was in as a primary caucus candidate in 2019, she did a fantastic job. She's a strong speaker. She can make an argument. She's got that lawyer prosecutor background to make her case. So I would expect her to do a better job answering questions and a better job making a case against Donald Trump. The other thing I think that will be important in the next presidential debate is the focus can shift back to Trump on some issues related to age and, ethics, morals, whatever that might be. People were so caught up on Biden after the last debate, I think because people didn't expect him to perform that poorly. So there was a lot of talk about that. And so a lot of talk about how he wasn't making sense in some of his answers. I think the general public is so used to Donald Trump not making sense in his answers that he kind of got a pass in that debate. And Biden didn't take the opportunity to point that out as the debate was happening. And I think Harris will do a much better job of that. I'll be curious to see if Trump decides to debate her or not. I think he should be a little nervous debating her, but I also think his ego is so big that he will want to try to go head to head against her. He'll probably be able to rally, his supporters against her, but he may, if he's not careful in what he says, may end up further isolating himself, particularly among women voters and people of color.
Mm. Well, before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about some media things that are happening. I work on the social media side of things for Forbes, and you've studied it. Now, we have some interesting memes going around about Kamala Harris. We have, if anybody's on TikTok or Instagram, you see the coconut falling from a tree meme. You see the Charlie XCX brat meme going around. We also talk about the value of the young voters, right? Like getting them out, mobilizing them. Mm-hmm. So what does this mean for her? She's really embraced this too. She's kind of like leaned into this idea of riding the social media viral wave. So what is that going to do for her? And how does that help her?
Well, I think it's really important to engage young people. It's where young people are. I'll say when the coconut thing started, I had a friend text something to me and I did not understand what this TikTok video was. So I'm not the demographic for that, but I've since been like, what's going on here? Because I do study it, and it is very interesting, and I think very strategic to go to voters where they are. Historically, that's been, local news hour advertisements and traditional news media, but it also, for a lot of people, is social media. We saw, Barack Obama did a great job using Facebook very early on in his 2008 campaign. And then again in 2012, we're in now the TikTok era, which is interesting given also the TikTok policy, all of that stuff, but we'll set that aside. But leaning into the discourse and the mediums that young people are using, which, I think her and her campaign are already doing a good job of that. And that's the sort of stuff that's going to get people excited, especially young people. Obviously, I'm not that demographic, but I'm excited for other reasons. But it's certainly, it's new, right? It's not Biden's campaign. And I think it really sets her apart as a younger, more aware candidate than Joe Biden or Donald Trump are.
Yeah, the amount of hype reels I saw of her just on Sunday coming through all my social media channels. Yeah. It's like, we are here. This is happening now. But yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it. What, before I let you go, what is kind of your last bit of context to voters of what they should be looking for over the next couple of weeks? What have you got your eye on?
I think the big thing will be polling in swing states. We haven't had a poll that puts Harris against Trump when she's actually the candidate. There's been some hypothetical polling, but what does that polling look like in swing states? In U.S. elections, the popular vote is not what wins the election. So, what are things looking like in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia? Those will be the places that I'm really paying attention to see where there might be ground to gain with Kamala as the candidate. I think I'll also be really watching to see if there's debates or how the candidates talk about each other and what that might do to bring in voters or to alienate voters in the next few weeks. And really, I'm curious to see what the Trump campaign does, given this changes their whole strategy and how they're going to try to attack Harris in a way that is productive and doesn't further alienate folks.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Winfrey. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.